Good evening to you.
Evening.
First of all, thank you for being the first Cabinet Minister to grace
Great
Piers
pleasure.
Morgan Uncensored with your presence. It's appreciated. Secondly, I would imagine you must be a bit exhausted, aren't you?
It's a busy time, and as commuters try to get themselves into work, the world has changed, of course, which the unions don't seem to have realised, and many people simply working from home where they can. Those who aren't are the people that the unions claim they want to represent, but it's people who need to get to work because their jobs require them to be physically there. Maybe hospital cleaners, for example, who the RMT says they want to help. They're actually harming those people the most, and that's the great pity of what's going on this week.
Well, I was actually not referring to the strikes, which I'm about to come to. I was referring to the fact that you get wheeled out to defend the indefensible on behalf of your boss, Boris Johnson, more than any other Cabinet Minister. It's a job that you do with great, I don't know if enthusiasm is the right word, but you certainly seem to embrace the job, the role of defending the indefensible. That's why I thought you may look a bit exhausted.
Oh, I see. Well, look, when it comes to the big subject of today, your introduction on the strikes, what I'm about to say is, very defensible. What is indefensible in itself is carrying out a strike under a false pretense that there won't be a pay rise when there was always going to be one, and sticking to 1950s rules which prevent our railways from operating properly on behalf of passengers. So, as it happens, at least for today, I'm very, very pleased to be on your show and being able to put across this point of view.
OK, we'll come back to Boris Johnson a bit later. Let me just cut to the quick about what's going on here. A lot of people feel that, notwithstanding the fact that technically you're correct, Network Rail, it's their job, they're the employer, they should be negotiating with the unions. The country is in total chaos. There's no sign of this ending. And when it comes to direct government intervention in our rail system, I mean, you couldn't have done more than you've done in the last 2-3 years during this pandemic by piling £16 billion worth of investment of our money into propping it up and saving jobs and so on, which is to your credit. But that shows you are prepared to directly intervene in keeping our trains running during a pandemic, which prompts the question, well, why aren't you getting involved now? It doesn't seem to me to be credible to have done all this for so long and now to say, actually, not my job, Gov.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a negotiation over terms and conditions and pay, which is between the union and the employer. It is the only place that discussion can take place. And it's a stunt that the RMT, Mick Lynch, are now saying, oh no, what we need are ministers in the room. That's a stunt because actually only last month Mick Lynch was saying we would never negotiate with the government. Actually, he said we'd never negotiate with the Tory government, which might give something about his frame of mind about all this. There isn't actually anything helpful that I could do by being in the room. In fact, it would undermine those negotiations because they're not just about pay, they're about a whole host of other things. What the unions need to do is get back in the room, stop flouncing out and get on with the talks.
You clearly believe as a government that you cannot give the union that is currently running this strike what they want for their members. They're demanding up to 11% pay rises for their members. You don't think that you can do that. Why?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we were incredibly, I think everyone would say, generous with the railways, with the workers. You mentioned that £16 billion that we paid during coronavirus to keep them going and to make sure that every single one of those railway workers kept their job. Every single one. That's £600 per household in this country. So no one, I think, in terms of motivations, no one wants the railway to succeed more than we do. I love the railways. I want them to be really good for the 21st century, for the passenger in the 21st century. But reality are realities. We cannot just keep pumping in hundreds of pounds per household in this country to keep the railway afloat when the passengers haven't come back. And the great pity about strikes is that for every week of strikes, as we've seen this week, what happens is it will cost 150 million pounds to the railways. That's money that could be going to pay more salaries, which is instead going to waste on these strikes. So that actually making the position worse, not better, through these strikes.
How do you square, though, this kind of new parsimonious view of capping effectively what you can pay people in the public sector with this revelation today that the government is looking to scrap the cap on banker bonuses? And that's not been denied by the Prime Minister today at PMQ. So is that true? Have you told businesses that because we're now not in the European Union, they no longer have to abide by that rule that they couldn't have more than 100% bonus?
Well, look, for a start, the government looks after the areas of the public sector which are under its overall control. So, teachers, nurses, doctors, railways. Those are the things that we can directly affect. What the private sector pays under different circumstances is their business. I hope you'll forgive me. I'm not an expert on city rules, but my understanding is that there are always discussions and considerations about, particularly now we're outside of the EU, where caps lie in all of this. But I will have to leave it to the Treasury and others who will be better informed.
But you would understand. I was
going to say they're not, of course, public workers.
Right, but if I understand the distinction, obviously. But clearly, if the UK government is telling people in the banking world, you can remove the cap on your bonuses. We're not in the European Union anymore. Haven't got to abide by these caps. Off you go, lads. Fill your boots. That does jar very heavily with people right now who are struggling to feed their kids or queuing in food banks, or indeed, people like Mick Lynch on behalf of his members would say, well, this is completely outrageous. So I think it's a perfectly valid question to ask any member of the cabinet, frankly, as to whether this is true. Have you guys given the nod to the banking world? You can give yourself what you like as bonuses.
No, I know, and this is the thing. What you get is a letter which I think may have been leaked or something, which is actually a discussion, I imagine, within government. As I say, I'm not involved in this particular area of policy, so I wouldn't want to jump to any conclusions on that at all. Presumably, those in the Treasury are considering how to make sure that the City of London, which is one of the most successful financial sectors in the world, which pays billions and billions of pounds in tax, which helps us to get all of these public services, remains internationally competitive. But as I say, that's a private sector activity. What I'm dealing with here with the rail situation is the public sector. And I do just want to say, and I'll make this point actually because it is relevant. Don't run away with the idea that our railway workers, 100,000 of them, are poorly paid. The median salary, the average salary, is 44,000. Rail drivers, these are not the drivers on strike, I should point out, but rail drivers, median average salary, 59,000. A fifth of them earn over 70,000. There are railway drivers on over £100,000. This is not a badly paid sector. Nurses, for example, would earn perhaps 31,000. Care workers, 21,000.
I don't
so the government has to.
I'm not
balance
unsympathetic.
Out where these
Listen,
pay rises go. Right?
I had a big set to with Mick Lynch last week. I'm not in total disagreement with what you're saying. I think that if you're going to start shelling out big pay rises, nursing staff should be top of the list. It would be my view. But I do think that this issue of the private sector and a word from the government that you can all fill your boots with bonuses, it could not be worse timed for you when you're trying to have a position as a government that there's not enough money in the pot for the public sector. If the same government is going around removing any caps so that people in the banking community can enrich themselves, I think that's a very unfortunate juxtaposition. And I would simply ask you clearly, your position seems to be you don't know the truth about this, but if that was the case, would you share my view that it would be outrageous?
Well, actually, I was going to say there's a fairly straightforward principle. The government deals with the money that it taxes and raises and then spends on things like salaries. The government doesn't generally get involved in legislation about what, for example, a TV presenter could earn as a bonus. That's unusual. Now, after the financial crash, governments around the world have been more involved in setting these private sector or limits on private sector bonuses, for example. It's not generally what governments get involved with. As I say, you're slightly asking me outside of my area of speciality. I do know that the City of London is responsible for paying for the taxes that allow us to have a lot of our public services. And I imagine that the relevant ministers will be interested in getting that balance right to make sure we have a competitive City of London, which is able to compete globally and bring in more taxes to pay for all the public services that we want in this country. OK,
let me just finally on these strikes. Mick Lynch says he's met every transport minister, Tory transport minister in the last year. That presumably includes you.
Well, he usually works with the railway ministers, so there are rail ministers.
Have you met him?
He will have met. No, I don't. I haven't met with him. No.
You've never met Mick Lynch?
Not knowingly, no.
Not knowingly? Well, you think he's crept round your house when you're not looking?
As far as I'm aware, I didn't want to mislead you that he was at an event I was at once or something like that. But no, usually in government,
I've got to say, look, I understand all your reasons and rationale for not getting involved, as you say, in negotiation. But given what is going on in the country, given it's the very last thing anybody in this country needs or wants right now, surely there's going to be a moment when it just makes sense for you to pick the phone up to Mick Lynch and just have a conversation with him, isn't it? Ultimately, you are the Transport Secretary.
Yeah. That is right, but there is a rail minister whose job it is specifically
but you're his boss,
to deal
right?
with rail.
But you're his boss.
So how far do you take this? If there was a
you're the boss.
dispute, let me answer the question. If there was a pay dispute on your TV channel, which I believe is ultimately owned by Rupert Murdoch, would you expect Rupert Murdoch to walk in and resolve that dispute? No.
I'm sure he'd often get it. I would absolutely expect him to. Put it this way, if the entire country had been brought to its knees by whatever was going on, absolutely he would get involved.
But the point about this is you've got to have the right people in the room to settle these things. I can't settle this dispute. It is a stunt asking for ministers to walk into the room, and here's why. If you listen to Mick Lynch, you would have thought this was about a single figure, a single digit, what percentage pay rise there should be. It's not. There are at least 20 areas of reform, 20 areas where, for example, at the moment, there are jobs that Network Rail have to send out to fix and maintain the track, where they have to send 2 vans, even when 1 van will do, where they have to roster people so that an entire group goes out to do a job that a single person or 2 people could do for no good reason, where we can't run railways at the weekends, on Sundays in particular, because back in 1919, a Sunday wasn't a working day. Those are the details of the negotiations that are going on. And the idea that a minister walking into the room and somehow being there would alter those negotiations is completely wrong. In fact, what it would do is undermine the negotiations. And I hear Mick Lynch saying this as a stunt to divert attention from the fact he keeps walking out, as he's done again today, of these discussions. And by the way, I hear the Labour Party saying the same thing, which is interesting. So I had a look at the track record. Back in the Blair days, there was a very big firefighter strike, and the union said that ministers should get round the table. Blair said no. In the Brown days, there was a post-office workers' strike, and the union said the same thing. And the Brown government said no. Ministers don't get round the table because when he did back in either 70s with Harold Wilson, beer and sandwiches at Downing Street, or beer and curry, as I'm sure Sir Keir would prefer. What happened was it was a disaster. Our industrial relations were a disaster and the country was a disaster. That is not the way forward. The way forward is for the RMT to get back in the room and sort this out throughout the whole arena of the different issues that need resolving, many of which are to do with the modernisation of the railway, so it's fit for passengers.
Mick Lynch has a Facebook profile picture of himself as the Hood, the evil criminal mastermind from Thunderbirds. And I did suggest to him when we discussed this in a rather animated way on this show last week that you were the kind of Virgil character from the Thunderbirds. You actually look a bit like Virgil. And I pointed out that in the end, Virgil does emerge triumphant.
Well, I think we can take these comparisons too far. But I simply think you can't hold the world back against things which have fundamentally changed. For example, it used to be the case if you wanted to go on the train, you'd have to go to a ticket office and pick up your ticket. Now only 1 in 8 tickets are bought in that way, and yet we have exactly the same number of ticket offices, almost exactly the same as we had in the 90s, before the internet got going. You had a situation where the only way to check a track to maintain it properly was to send people out and have them walk along the track. It's dangerous. I read accident reports frequently, from people who've died because they've been hit by trains as they try and maintain the track. And nowadays, a train can be fitted with sensors and cameras and take 70,000 pictures per minute to check that track much more safely and more accurately than the human eye. But because the unions refuse to reform themselves, we end up with a railway stuck in the 1950s and 60s. That has to change, and he won't be able to hold out against that change because he just insists on calling his union members out on strike, and the country can't live with that.
Let me ask you about air travel, because that also comes under your remit. It's obviously been a busy time for you. What kind of grade would you give yourself for the way you've handled aviation for this country since the pandemic began?
Well, look, I think aviation has had a very tough time, quite clearly. Just to put this into context, the government has provided £8 billion. And when I say the government, I mean, you, the taxpayer, whoever's watching this, has paid £8 billion to the aviation companies, independent companies, to keep them afloat. So I think we've done our part, would be what I'd say. I'd also acknowledge that due to the stop-start nature of the pandemic, of the restrictions, it wasn't easy for them. In the end, unfortunately, I think that they lost too many people. They're scrambling to employ them back. We're trying to do whatever we can to help, including changes of the law. In fact, I've today just made a second change to the law to do with something to do with airport slots that the airlines use to make it easier for them to hand those back and to have a more organised approach to what is a global problem. Because if you go to Schiphol...
It is a global problem.
Yeah.
When you say you've done OK, the IATA, who represent 300 airlines, including British Airways, have concluded the UK government's handling of the aviation sector in the pandemic was, their quotes, the poster child of what not to do. And the UK aviation sector ended up suffering the worst of all of Europe during the pandemic. That's not OK, is it? That's a shambles.
I fundamentally disagree. First of all, other countries have got different models, which included putting a lot more taxpayers' money into these private companies. I think there's a balance. People don't want their taxes to endlessly go up. We did what we needed, £8 billion to help them survive, but we didn't follow the model of some governments, which was to take over effectively their airlines. That is true. But here's what we did do. We got out of the pandemic first, because we jabbed people first. And that was because of some phenomenal leadership in this country that led to Margaret Keenan receiving the first ever jab. That means we were released from the lockdown. We were released from all the testing, way ahead of other countries. That probably gave our aviation sector the additional issue of having to try and recover faster.
I mean,
but let's not present. I was just going to say this. Let's not present it as a British problem, because actually, if you go to Schiphol or if you go to the United States or if you go to Dublin, everybody is experiencing the same problem. So let's not pretend it's some sort of British problem.
No. I mean, I do hear a lot of ministers talking up how brilliantly we handled the pandemic. But of course, we do have, I think, still the highest death toll in terms of people who died in Europe.
That's not true.
No, not death rate. Not death rate.
Okay.
Death toll.
Okay.
The actual physical number of people who died.
Well,
so
I think
the idea that the first phase of this pandemic was anything but a disaster, I think, is for the birds. But look, I want to move on quickly to Rwanda.
We argued about that many times at the time, I know. And look, all I'd say is I think in retrospect, there have now been much more comprehensive and detailed surveys published, which take the global and European comparisons, and actually we did pretty well overall. But probably not go back 2 years.
I give the government credit for the vaccine programme. I give it credit for reopening the country at the start of this year. I think those are both good decisions, which have been completely vindicated. And as you say, you've got to look at it in totality. But I think the first phase of all this, it was pretty disastrous. Let me ask you quickly about Rwanda. We've got Prince Charles, you've got Boris Johnson going out there. Prince Charles, it was briefed and not been denied, believes that the government's Rwanda policy of sending people who try and come in illegally to this country to Rwanda is appalling. What is your response to that?
Well, I'd never comment on sort of royal, we haven't had this confirmed or denied. I'd never comment on that anyway, but I will comment on the policy itself. And that's simply to say that I think what is incredibly inhumane is standing by and watching people drowning in our channel, watching people pay people smugglers and criminal gangs to bring them to this country. And other than wringing our hands and saying this is terrible, simply not having a plan to deal with it. And that is essentially, well, as far as I can tell, the position of everyone else, every other party, every political party in this country, apart from the Conservative Party. You may not agree with the plan, but we have a plan, and that is to ensure that people are put off, that we stop the trade, the illegal traffic in people at its root, rather than having people come across.
Let me ask you, do you really believe in this? Because how does this fly with the fact that you personally have taken in a Ukraine family? You've taken in a mother, a young child, I think the grandmother as well, and the dog. You've done this now for several months with your family, already a big family. You've done this selfless act of humanity for people fleeing war-torn Ukraine. Do you really feel comfortable having done that? It's incredibly laudable, by the way. You're one of the very few ministers that's done this. It's very laudable, but at the same time, how does that sit with genuinely wanting people to think you are happy with people coming from war-torn countries, literally in some cases washing up on our shore, and the first response from this country is to send them off to Rwanda in a plane?
Well, I'd say two things. First of all, the family who've come to stay with me were fleeing from Ukraine, which is a country at war with literally missiles landing by their house. They've come from a war zone to the United Kingdom, and I'm pleased that we've been able to give them, I call them evacuees rather than refugees, but a safe place to live. The people in France are in France, right? They're in a free country, in a free European country, where they are absolutely legally entitled to claim asylum. So they're not coming out. So they've already come out of. They're not in a war zone in France. The second thing I'd say is I've been to Rwanda. I don't know how many people will have done, and I know it is a particularly well administered in terms of the government, in terms of the lack of corruption, in terms of its public services country. And I think sometimes people hear Africa and they hear Rwanda, and I'm not sure there's not a sort of tinge to the way that some people think about this policy and somehow think less of it because of the location. What I know for sure
let me ask you, are all the Ukrainian refugees, are they all coming straight from Ukraine? Are they coming by other European countries?
No, they're not necessarily.
Well, then by your argument, I'm sorry, but Minister, by your argument, the argument about using, well, look, the others are turning up at France and they should be able to stay there. Oh. What about people who leave Ukraine and go to Poland and then come to the UK? I mean, it's the same argument. Some of these people in France have come from Yemen, they've come from Syria, where they're both active wars. Others have come from wars where we've been directly responsible for the mayhem, Iraq, Afghanistan. So to me, the moral argument is the same. And I simply ask you, as somebody who's had the goodness of his heart as a family, to take in this Ukrainian family, which I think is an incredible thing to do. I just find it hard to believe that you're that comfortable with people who may have come from similar places, fleeing oppression and war, that you're that comfortable with literally saying, no, you're not coming in, you're going to Africa.
So let me explain why I am. For a start, with some of those other locations that you mentioned, Syria, for example, Afghanistan, we have had programs from Syria, for example, to take in thousands of refugees, and we actually do it often from the displaced camps. So we actually work with the UN and we bring people across. We have to recognise as a country that actually a lot of time what happens is people will move around the world for perfectly good reasons, for economic reasons, and that's a choice people will make. Where people want to claim asylum, they're able to do so legally. It is irresponsible of any government to allow a route, and I ask you, what is the other option? To allow a route to open up where criminals, criminal gangs and people traffickers are allowed to be a legitimate route into this country.
No, I think I completely agree. That's unacceptable. But we seem to have managed to
and nothing else has worked.
Right, we've taken in 70,000 Ukrainian refugees in a matter of weeks through safe routes.
Yeah.
So my response would be, why are we not trying to get similar safe routes for people coming from other war zones?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, as I say, people are able to come here and claim asylum from all around the world, and that does happen. When they come here through a legal route, they maintain that legal ability to do so. What we have to do is stop people from dying in the Channel. And so far, I've not heard anybody who says, well, it's wrong that people go to Rwanda. I've not heard them come up with another solution, because there isn't.
I've nothing against Rwanda, but I've got a big problem with the taxpayer shelling out £500,000 a pop for empty planes on tarmacs who end up going to Spain rather than Rwanda.
In which case, let's tackle the law, not the law, the legal establishment, which will fight this endlessly. And by the way, to put that into comparison, we spend £1 billion a year on dealing with the upshot of this asylum system not working. So, I understand that it will cost money to establish a new route, but what about all the money it costs to maintain a system which is fundamentally broken?
But if you keep
people are dying
no, I understand,
in the Channel.
If you keep
we must do something about it.
I agree. If you keep being blocked, though, by the law, and the law is what it is. It's a law, so they're currently
Well,
winning.
no, that's, I mean, the job I do in this place behind me here is change the law.
Right, I understand.
When the law isn't working,
I understand, but my
our
point
job is to change it.
My point is, if you literally can't get this plan to work, at what point do you abandon it and stop wasting taxpayer money?
Oh, look, I think we're only at the beginning. We're going to make the plan work. I mean, we are a determined government who do a lot of difficult things, whether it's long-term social care that no government tackled for a long time, or a whole levelling up agenda, which is for another day possibly. We do the difficult things in this country. We build the infrastructure, the integrated rail plan, £96 billion in the North and the Midlands of new railways. We are prepared to take those decisions.
How would you feel? How would you feel, though? How would you feel if I said to you, all right, Mr. Shapps, I'm sorry, but we're going to take your Ukrainian family and we're going to put them on a plane to Rwanda tomorrow?
So the Ukrainian family.
Well, the Ukrainian family that you're currently hosting.
Yeah, the Ukrainian family that lives with me.
Could you have that conversation with them?
Well, I was going to say they came here through a legal route.
I understand. I understand the distinction. I'm talking about the morality of it. Really, is that could you imagine having that conversation with them and saying, you're not going to stay in safe Britain. You're going to go to Rwanda, which has a pretty poor record of human rights.
That's no more relevant than saying, can I imagine my family being asked to go to Rwanda? I mean, we're talking about here people who've been trafficked by criminal gangs across the Channel illegally, knowing that what they're doing is illegal, and knowing that when they get here in the future, there's a good chance that you will end up being in Rwanda. And what will happen in the end, of course, once that policy is up and running, is that it will close down the criminal gangs, and that will save a lot of lives, and we can concentrate on legal approaches to migration.
Look, there's a lot of big ifs, And
again, I ask, to people who object, and I say sometimes they're saying it's on moral grounds. I slightly worry that it's their reaction to the fact this happens to be an African country. I've been an Africa minister, so I know Africa very well, and I know that country reasonably well. It's well run, it's well administrated, it has very low levels of corruption by global corruption indexes.
It has a poor record on human rights. A lot poorer than this country.
When it comes to migration, it also has a very good record as well. And I do worry that people talking about this say it sometimes without really appreciating or suggesting an alternative to people dying in the Channel.
Well, I can agree with you.
That's what I'd like to hear what the other option is.
Well, I agree that the current
to shut off the demand.
I agree. The current situation can't go on, but we did with the Ukraine emergency suddenly find ourselves capable of taking in 70,000 people.
And this country's been very generous, not just in Ukraine, but in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Hong Kong, and many other places. We're a very generous country.
Let me ask you about what it's been like to have a Ukraine family living in your house.
We have two cats, and they've moved out the house largely to live in the front garden. They're not keen on the Ukrainian dog Max, who seems to scare the living daylights out of our cats. So there's been that. There's been a few adjustments to make. We're a room short, and so one of our kids is at university, so we've been using his room when he comes home. There's a sofa bed we pull out and what have you. So there are a few adjustments to make. But, generally speaking, we're delighted to have them with us. They're lovely people. Their country's under attack. And the way I feel about what's going on in Ukraine is it's not just Putin attacking some country, across in Eastern Europe. He's attacking all of our freedoms and all of our rights. And if we don't stop him there, he'll carry on west. We've seen this sort of thing in the world before. So I think it's a small price to pay to have a family live with us in return for, trying to help with that situation.
Well, it's a great thing that you do for that family, and I'm sure it's hugely appreciated by them and by Ukraine. Thank you very much, Mr. Shapps, to be my first cabinet minister.
It's a pleasure.
We went long with it because I wasn't quite sure if we'll ever get another one. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks.